On the morning of Sunday, February 1st, 2015, employees at RadioShack stores across America showed up for work and were told to go home. Not at the end of a shift, at the beginning of one. Some got a phone call the night before. Some found out when they arrived at the door and the manager wouldn't meet their eyes. A few learned from the news. The stores closed without ceremony, without announcement, without a single word to the customers who had been shopping there for decades. One day the lights were on, the next day they weren't. This was not a single store. This was not a regional chain running out of runway. This was RadioShack, 94 years old, with more locations across America than most people could count. A company so embedded in the fabric of this country that its green and white logo had become as familiar as a street sign. At its peak, RadioShack operated more than 7,000 stores in the United States alone. It sold Americans their first CB radios, their first walkie-talkies, their first home computers. It employed the people who could explain in plain language why your amplifier was humming and what you could do about it. It was the place where a 12-year-old with $3 and a question could walk out an hour later with a transistor, a schematic, and the beginning of an education that no classroom had offered. And then it was gone. But the real story of RadioShack is not about a company that couldn't compete with Amazon. It is about a company that had every advantage imaginable: distribution, trust, technical knowledge, and a head start on the future that no competitor could match, and dismantled those advantages one decision at a time over 3 decades, until there was nothing left worth saving. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories of the American companies that built things, taught things, and disappeared. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins in Boston, Massachusetts in the year 1921. The name came from a ship. On board ocean vessels in the early 20th century, the radio equipment was housed in a small wooden structure bolted to the deck. Cramped, functional, essential. Sailors called it the Radio Shack. It was not glamorous. It was the place where signals were sent and received, where the invisible became audible, where a man with headphones and a steady hand could reach across hundreds of miles of open water and make contact with another human being. 2 brothers in Boston thought that was a fine name for a store. Theodore and Milton Deutschman opened the first Radio Shack in 1921 at 46 Brattle Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a modest retail and mail-order operation aimed at the one customer no other store was serving well: the American ham radio operator. Amateur radio in the 1920s was not a casual hobby. It was an obsession, a discipline, a small subculture of men and boys who built their own receivers, strung antennas from rooftops, and spent their evenings pulling signals out of the static. These were people who wanted to understand how things worked, not just use them. They needed components, wire, coils, crystals, the raw materials of communication. RadioShack was built to serve them. The store was small, the ambitions were not. By 1939, RadioShack had issued its first mail-order catalog, extending its reach beyond Boston to the broader community of electronics enthusiasts scattered across the country. A decade later, in 1947, the company opened what it called the first audio showroom in America, a dedicated space where customers could sit, listen, and compare speakers, amplifiers, turntables, and phonograph cartridges side by side. This was not standard retail practice in 1947. Most electronics were sold from behind a counter by a salesman who handed you a box. RadioShack put the equipment in your hands and let you hear the difference for yourself. It was an early expression of something that would define the company for the next 4 decades. The belief that the customer deserved to understand what they were buying, and that understanding came from experience, not from a sales pitch. But belief alone does not keep the lights on. By the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, RadioShack was in serious trouble. The company had expanded its product line in too many directions. Its inventory had ballooned to roughly 40,000 items, and its financial controls were, by most accounts, nearly non-existent. The mail-order business was losing money. The retail stores were losing money. The company that had been built to serve the most technically curious customers in America was drowning in its own complexity, unable to translate a loyal audience into a sustainable business. By 1963, RadioShack was carrying losses that had pushed it to the edge of bankruptcy. Its net worth was negative. Its future, by any reasonable measure, was behind it. And then Charles Tandy made a phone call. Charles David Tandy was not an electronics man, he was a leather man. Born in 1918 in Harmon, Oklahoma, raised in Fort Worth, Texas, he had built his fortune selling leather goods, moccasin kits, coin purses, hobby craft supplies, through a chain of retail stores that understood one thing above all others. The American consumer wanted to make things with their hands, and if you put the right materials in front of them at the right price, they would come back again and again. Tandy Leather had grown steadily through the 1950s by selling to Boy Scouts, hobbyists, and craft enthusiasts. It was not a glamorous business, it was a disciplined one. Charles Tandy understood margins, inventory turns, and the psychology of the do-it-yourself customer better than almost anyone in American retail. He understood that the person who builds something themselves has a relationship with that object, and with the store that supplied it, that no ordinary purchase can replicate. In 1962, Tandy began looking at the consumer electronics market. What he saw was RadioShack, a company with a loyal customer base, a recognizable name, a mail-order operation with national reach, and management so disorganized that it had turned all of those assets into a liability. By April 1963, the Tandy Corporation had acquired management control of RadioShack for approximately $300,000. The company they were buying had a negative net worth. Most people in the industry thought Tandy had made a mistake. Within 2 years, he had turned a $4 million annual loss into a profit. The method was not complicated, but it required discipline that the previous management had never applied. Tandy cut the product line from roughly 40,000 items to approximately 2,500, eliminating everything that was not essential to the core customer: the electronics hobbyist, the tinkerer, the man who wanted to build or repair something and needed the right part at a fair price. He closed the unprofitable mail-order division. He implemented tight inventory controls and weekly performance metrics across every store. And then he did something that would define the culture of RadioShack for the next 2 decades. He shared the profits with the people running the stores. Tandy's profit-sharing program was not a token gesture. Store managers who performed were compensated accordingly. And by the mid-1970s, the program had reportedly created dozens of millionaires among the people who ran individual RadioShack locations. A store manager in suburban Ohio or a strip mall in Arizona could, if they ran their location well, build genuine wealth. That created a culture of ownership, people who treated their stores not as jobs but as businesses, who knew their customers by name and knew what those customers needed before they asked. This was the engine that built the RadioShack of memory. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the stores multiplied at a pace that bordered on aggressive. Hundreds of new locations opened each year, positioned not in large destination malls, but in neighborhood shopping centers and strip malls, close to where people lived, easy to park in front of, small enough to feel personal. By 1978, RadioShack operated more than 4,600 stores, strategically placed across America. A journalist of the period described the expansion as the McDonald's of electronics, a franchise-style ubiquity that put a RadioShack within driving distance of nearly every American household. And the timing was perfect. The 1970s brought the CB radio boom, a cultural phenomenon that swept across working-class and middle-class America with a speed that surprised everyone, including the people selling the equipment. Truckers had used Citizens Band radios for years to communicate on the highway. Then Smokey and the Bandit hit theaters in 1977. The song Convoy reached #1 on the pop charts in 1975. Suddenly everyone wanted a CB radio, and RadioShack, already positioned as the accessible, affordable source for electronics, was exactly where they went to get one. At the peak of the craze, CB radios accounted for more than 20% of RadioShack's total sales. But Charles Tandy was already thinking about what came next. The heart of every RadioShack store during this period was not the product on the shelf. It was the person behind the counter. RadioShack employees were, by design and by culture, people who knew things. They could explain the difference between an ohm and a watt. They could diagnose a blown capacitor by sound. They could look at a schematic and tell a first-time builder where he had gone wrong. Charles Tandy had built his stores around the belief that the customer who understood what they were buying was a better customer, more loyal, more likely to return, more likely to send their son in the following Saturday with a list of parts. That culture, technical knowledge as a form of customer service, was not an accident. It was a strategy, and for 2 decades, it worked. By the time Charles Tandy died in November 1978 at the age of 60, RadioShack was one of the most recognizable retail brands in the United States. His successor, John Roach, inherited a company at the peak of its cultural authority, a company that had just, in the summer of 1977, done something that would rewrite the history of American technology. It had sold America its first home computer, and it had almost decided not to. In the mid-1970s, a RadioShack buyer named Don French purchased a kit computer called the MITS Altair 8800. He did not buy it for RadioShack. He bought it for himself, out of personal curiosity, and used it to manage inventory at his store. But as he worked with the machine, as he understood what it could do, and more importantly, what it could do for the 11 million customers who walked through RadioShack's doors every year, he began to see something that the rest of his company was not yet looking for. He began designing his own computer. French brought his ideas to John Roach, then Tandy's vice president of manufacturing. Roach was not immediately convinced by the design, but he was convinced by the concept. In mid-1976, French and Roach traveled to National Semiconductor in California, where they encountered a 24-year-old engineer named Steve Leininger, a member of the Homebrew Computer Club, the informal gathering of Silicon Valley tinkerers that would eventually count Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak among its regulars. Leininger knew microprocessors the way RadioShack's best store employees knew capacitors, not from a textbook, but from the inside out. They hired him away from National Semiconductor in November 1976. He was given a budget and a deadline and a mandate to build a complete pre-assembled home computer that RadioShack could sell from its stores. The resistance inside the company was immediate and fierce. One executive told French directly, "Don't waste my time, we can't sell computers." The objection was not irrational. The median price of a RadioShack product at the time was roughly $30. A home computer would cost 20 times that. The company had 11 million customers, but it was far from clear that any of them wanted something so expensive and so unfamiliar. Executives pointed to Sears, which had lost money on an early video technology called Cartravision. As evidence of what happened when a retailer overreached into consumer technology, it didn't understand. French and Leininger pushed forward anyway. Every cost decision on the new machine was made with price in mind. Leaving out lowercase letter capability saved $1.50 in components and reduced the retail price by $5. The monitor was a modified RCA black and white television set. The data storage device was a RadioShack cassette tape player. These were not the choices of engineers indifferent to quality. They were the choices of engineers who understood that the machine would never reach the people it was meant for if it cost more than those people could spend. French and Leininger suggested the company should plan to build at least 50,000 units. Management disagreed. John Roach persuaded Tandy's leadership to approve a production run of exactly 3,500, one for each RadioShack store in the country, so that if the computers didn't sell, each location could use one to manage its own inventory. The logic was cautious to the point of being insulting to the product, but it was approved. The TRS-80 Model D was revealed to the public on August 3, 1977. It launched alongside 2 other machines that summer, the Apple II, priced at $1,298, and the Commodore PET, priced at $795. The TRS-80 base system, including the monitor, sold for $599. It required a $50 deposit to order. It came with a full-stroke keyboard, a basic programming language interpreter built into its memory, and enough capability to run games, manage household finances, and teach a curious 12-year-old the first principles of how a computer thinks. Within days of the announcement, more than 15,000 people called RadioShack to place orders. The switchboard was paralyzed. The company that had approved 3,500 units because it wasn't sure anyone would want the product was suddenly facing demand that dwarfed every projection it had made. RadioShack sold more than 10,000 TRS-80s in the first 6 weeks. Over the lifetime of the Model 1, it sold more than 200,000 units. By 1979, The TRS-80 had the largest selection of available software of any microcomputer on the market. By 1980, Tandy was selling roughly 3 times as many computers as Apple. By 1982, RadioShack was still the largest personal computer retailer in the United States. The machine that management had almost refused to build was, for 5 years, the best-selling home computer in America. But something else was happening inside the company. Something quieter. Something that would not become fully visible for another decade, but whose consequences would eventually be measured in thousands of stores and tens of thousands of jobs. The people who had built the TRS-80 were leaving. Don French left RadioShack after the company rejected his proposal to open a chain of Tandy computer centers, stores that would sell not just Tandy products, but computers from any manufacturer, positioning RadioShack as the destination for the emerging personal computer market, the way it had been the destination for ham radio a generation earlier. The proposal made strategic sense. It would have placed RadioShack at the center of an industry that was doubling in size every 2 years. The company said no. Steve Leininger, the 24-year-old engineer who had designed the machine that sold 200,000 units and helped launch the personal computer revolution, left his position as Director of Advanced Research in 1981. He was 29 years old. The 2 men who had built RadioShack's most important product in its history were gone before that product had reached its 5th birthday. What replaced their vision was not a strategy. It was an assumption. The assumption that the TRS-80's success belonged to RadioShack's retail network, rather than to the specific culture of curiosity and technical ambition that French and Leininger had brought to the project. The company continued to develop computers through the early 1980s. The TRS-80 color computer, launched in 1980, competed with Commodore and Atari in the home market. The Model 100 portable computer, released in 1983 and marketed with advertisements featuring science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, was regarded by technology journalists as one of the most elegantly designed portable computers of its era. By 1984, computers accounted for 35% of Tandy's total sales. The company had 500 dedicated RadioShack computer centers operating across the country. From the outside, it looked like momentum. From the inside, the direction had already changed. Tandy had always approached its computer line with a degree of ambivalence that its early sales numbers had never fully resolved. The machines were expensive relative to the rest of the RadioShack catalog. The margins were thinner than on batteries, cables, and components. The support requirements, repairs, software questions, compatibility issues, consumed store employee time in ways that a $3 transistor never had. And as IBM entered the personal computer market in 1981 with a machine that set the industry standard, and as Apple continued to grow, the competitive pressure on Tandy's proprietary systems intensified in ways that a leather company turned electronics retailer was not structurally prepared to absorb. According to a former executive who later spoke to Bloomberg News, store managers were instructed to keep computer sales below 10% of their overall business mix. The reasoning was straightforward. Hardware margins were shrinking, and leadership did not want the stores to become dependent on a product category that it was not certain it could win. What that instruction actually meant, in practice, was that RadioShack was deliberately limiting the growth of the one product line that the market was moving toward, at the precise moment when the market was moving fastest. In 1993, Tandy Corporation exited the personal computer business entirely, selling its manufacturing assets to a company called AST Research. RadioShack had been the largest personal computer retailer in the United States as recently as 1982. It had built the machine that outsold Apple by a factor of 3 in 1980. It had put computing within reach of American families who could not afford what its competitors were charging. And then, methodically, over the course of a decade, it had walked away from all of it. Not because the market had rejected RadioShack, but because RadioShack had decided, at the executive level, that the future was not worth the margin risk. The CB radio boom had faded, the computer opportunity had been surrendered, and RadioShack, the company that had taught a generation of Americans how to think about electronics, now needed to find a new reason for people to walk through its doors. It thought it had found one in the cell phone. It had not found salvation. It had found a slower way to disappear. The cell phone arrived in RadioShack stores in the early 1990s, like a lifeline thrown to a man who had not yet admitted he was drowning. The logic was defensible. Radio Shack had always been the place Americans went when a new technology became available and affordable. It had done this with ham radio in the 1920s, with high-fidelity audio in the 1940s, with CB radio in the 1970s, with home computers in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Each time, Radio Shack had positioned itself at the entry point of an emerging market and captured the customers who wanted to be first. Mobile phones seemed to fit the same pattern. The technology was new, the hardware was complicated enough to require explanation, and Radio Shack's store network, thousands of neighborhood locations staffed by people who understood electronics, seemed purpose-built to sell it. What the company did not fully reckon with was the difference between selling a product and selling a service contract. A customer who came in to buy a transistor or a length of coaxial cable made a decision in minutes and walked out. A customer signing up for a mobile phone plan required 45 minutes of an employee's time, filling out forms, verifying identity, processing carrier approvals, explaining rate structures that changed every few months. Multiply that across thousands of stores and tens of thousands of daily transactions, and the operational reality became clear. Radio Shack's small format stores, designed for quick, knowledgeable transactions, were being converted into de facto carrier kiosks that moved slowly, frustrated waiting customers, and consumed employee attention in ways the store layout had never been designed to accommodate. The customers who had defined Radio Shack for decades, the hobbyists, the engineers, the builders, the people who came in knowing exactly what they needed and trusting that the person behind the counter would know it too, began to notice something changing. The employee who could once diagnose an audio problem by ear was now primarily trained to explain the difference between two calling plans. The component section, once a destination in itself, was quietly shrinking. Drawers that had held hundreds of individual components were consolidated, then reduced, then pushed to the back of the store, then to a single small cabinet near the rear wall. The tinkerers stopped coming in as often, and when they did come in, they sometimes found that what they needed was no longer there. Radio Shack's leadership understood at some level that this was a problem. What they did not understand, or did not act on, was its severity. The company was generating revenue from wireless commissions. The numbers looked acceptable on a quarterly report. What the quarterly reports did not capture was the erosion of the one thing that had made Radio Shack irreplaceable: the trust of a customer who believed that the people inside that store knew more about electronics than anyone else on the block. That trust, once broken, does not repair itself with a new store layout or a rebranded logo. Meanwhile, outside the stores, the retail landscape was transforming at a speed that Radio Shack's leadership consistently underestimated. Best Buy had opened its first superstore in 1983 and spent the following decade building a big box model that offered wider selection, lower prices, and enough floor space to stock the full range of consumer electronics that Radio Shack's small format stores could never carry. Walmart was expanding its electronics departments, and in 1994, a company called Amazon opened for business online, selling books at first, then everything else, offering a selection and a price point that no physical store network could match. Radio Shack's response to the rise of e-commerce was, by any measure, inadequate. In the late 1990s, while Best Buy and Walmart were building early online retail operations, Radio Shack's website offered store locators and press releases. Customers could find out where their nearest Radio Shack was located. They could not buy anything. The company that had pioneered mail-order electronics sales with its 1939 catalog, that had understood 8 decades earlier that customers would order from a printed page if you gave them something worth ordering, failed to translate that instinct into the digital age. Radio Shack launched its e-commerce platform in the year 2000. Amazon had launched in 1994. The gap was not 6 years of lost sales. It was 6 years of lost infrastructure, logistics networks, customer data, digital supply chains, and the institutional knowledge of how to move product from a warehouse to a doorstep at a speed and cost that customers would accept. That kind of infrastructure cannot be built in a quarter or a fiscal year. Radio Shack spent the rest of its existence trying to close a distance that its competitors had spent 6 years extending. By the mid-2000s, the consequences of these compounding failures were beginning to surface in the financial statements. RadioShack's revenue peaked and began its decline. The company cycled through leadership with increasing urgency, each new executive arriving with a turnaround plan, each plan failing to address the structural reality that the company had surrendered its core identity without building a credible replacement. The employees who remained in the stores felt it before the analysts wrote about it. The drawers of components got smaller. The questions from customers got simpler. The RadioShack that had once felt like a destination, a place where something interesting might happen, where a conversation about electronics might lead somewhere unexpected, began to feel like a place where you went to buy a phone charger because the gas station next door had run out. That is not what RadioShack was built to be. And somewhere in the company, in meeting rooms in Fort Worth, in spreadsheets that measured revenue per square foot and wireless commission rates, the people making decisions either did not see it or decided they could not afford to fix it. The revenue numbers kept falling. The quarterly losses began to stack. And the villains, some of them wearing suits, some of them carrying hedge fund prospectuses, were already on their way. In February 2006, RadioShack's chief executive officer resigned. His name was David Edmondson, and he had been forced out after it was reported that he had misrepresented his academic credentials on his official biography, claiming degrees he had not earned from a college he had not attended. It was a personal scandal, not a strategic one, but it arrived at precisely the moment when RadioShack could least afford the distraction. The company was already losing ground. Its revenue was softening. Its identity was blurring. What it needed, in the spring of 2006, was a leader who understood electronics retail from the inside, someone who could articulate with conviction what RadioShack was for and who it was serving. What it got was a succession of executives from industries that had nothing to do with electronics. Edmondson was replaced by Claire Bobrowski, the Herky, a veteran of McDonald's. Bobrowski was succeeded by Julian Day, who had made his reputation as a cost-cutting specialist at Kmart. Day was followed by Jim Gooch, RadioShack's own chief financial officer, who resigned amid mounting losses in 2012 and was briefly replaced by Dorvin Lively in an acting capacity. Lively gave way to Joe Magnacca, recruited from Walgreens, who arrived in 2013 with an ambitious turnaround plan that included new store designs, a re-merchandised product assortment, and a marketing campaign intended to reintroduce RadioShack to an America that had largely stopped thinking about it. 6 chief executives in fewer than 10 years. Each one brought a diagnosis. Each one brought a plan. None of them had spent their careers in a RadioShack store, and none of them, despite their competence in other contexts, had the institutional knowledge to understand what the company had been at its best, or what it would take to return to anything resembling that. The revolving door of leadership was not merely a symptom of RadioShack's decline, it was an accelerant. Every transition reset the strategic clock. Every new executive spent months learning the business before making decisions, and the decisions, when they came, were shaped by the priorities of a turnaround specialist or a cost cutter, rather than by anyone who had ever helped a teenager build a crystal radio set on a Saturday afternoon. But the leadership failures, damaging as they were not the most consequential decision made during these years. That distinction belongs to Sprint. In the years following the 2006 leadership crisis, RadioShack doubled down on its wireless strategy with an intensity that transformed the stores more completely than any redesign or rebranding campaign could have. Carrier partnerships, with Sprint, with Verizon, with A-Tantit, became the primary revenue engine. The stores were restructured around the sale of mobile phones and service contracts. Display cases that had once held oscilloscopes and signal generators were replaced by illuminated phone pedestals. The language of the store shifted from the technical to the transactional. By 2011, Verizon had rejoined RadioShack's wireless lineup, deepening the company's dependence on mobile commissions at the precise moment when mobile carriers were beginning to build their own retail stores that were larger, better staffed for phone sales, and backed by the full resources of companies whose entire business was wireless service. RadioShack was competing for wireless customers against the very companies it was partnering with. The carriers had no long-term interest in sending customers to RadioShack when they could send them to their own locations. The partnership that was supposed to save RadioShack was, by its structure, designed to be temporary. And then came the arrangement that would define RadioShack's final chapter. By 2014, the company's financial situation had moved beyond distress into something closer to managed collapse. RadioShack was losing money at a rate that its cash reserves could not sustain. Its largest shareholder was a hedge fund called Standard General, and the relationship between RadioShack's public obligations as a retailer and Standard General's private financial interests would later become the subject of significant scrutiny. According to documents filed in the subsequent bankruptcy proceedings, a creditor group alleged that RadioShack had been kept on life support, continuing to operate unprofitable stores rather than shutting them down earlier and cutting losses, in order to avoid triggering credit default swaps held by Standard General. Those swaps were set to expire on December 20th, 2014. As long as RadioShack remained technically operational, the swaps did not pay out. The allegation, in plain terms, was that thousands of RadioShack employees continued to show up for work in the final months of 2014, not because the business had a future, but because a financial instrument had not yet matured. RadioShack's own management denied the characterization. The full truth of what drove the timing of the bankruptcy filing remains, in some respects, contested. What is not contested is what happened next. In January 2015, the Wall Street Journal reported that RadioShack had begun delaying rent payments to commercial landlords across the country. It was not a rumor. It was not speculation. The company had stopped paying the people who owned the buildings its stores occupied. For anyone who had been watching RadioShack's trajectory over the previous decade, the report was not surprising. It was confirmation of something that the quarterly loss statements had been suggesting for years, that the end was no longer a possibility to be managed, but a timeline to be negotiated. What happened in the weeks that followed revealed something about RadioShack's final days that went beyond ordinary corporate failure. On February 2nd, 2015, a Sunday, the first day of RadioShack's new fiscal year, stores across America began closing without warning. Employees arrived for their shifts and were told the store was done. Some received a phone call the night before. Some found out when they pulled into the parking lot and the manager was already locking the door. The closures were not announced publicly. There was no press release, no statement, no acknowledgement that tens of thousands of customers who had shopped at these locations for years would find them dark the next morning. The reason some stores closed that Sunday while others remained open was not strategic. It was contractual. The terms of RadioShack's loan from a lender called Salus Capital restricted the company to closing no more than 200 stores per year. Stores that remained open did so, not because they had customers or inventory or a reason to exist, but because a loan covenant said they had to. They operated with skeleton crews, nearly empty shelves, and reduced hours, a performance of retail that fooled no one, least of all the employees performing it. On February 3rd, RadioShack defaulted on its loan from Salus Capital. On February 5th, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing was accompanied by a list of 1,784 stores that RadioShack intended to close, a process it needed to complete before the end of the month to avoid an estimated $7 million in March rent obligations. The speed of the closures was not a sign of organizational efficiency. It was a sign of how little margin remained for anything resembling a dignified exit. But the detail that cut deepest, the one that transformed RadioShack's bankruptcy from a corporate failure into something closer to a betrayal, had nothing to do with store closures or lease negotiations or hedge fund credit swaps. RadioShack listed the personal information of 67 million customers as an asset for sale in its bankruptcy proceedings. 67 million people who had given RadioShack their names, addresses, and purchase histories over the years, often at the specific request of employees trained to ask for that information at the point of sale, now found that data being offered to the highest bidder as part of a liquidation. RadioShack had maintained for decades an explicit public promise that customer data would never be sold for any reason at any time. The promise had been stated in its privacy policy. It had been the stated justification for the name and address collection practice that had become, over the years, something of a cultural joke. The RadioShack cashier who asked for your zip code before ringing up a 9-volt battery. The joke, it turned out, had always contained a transaction. The customers had not known what they were agreeing to. Attorneys general from multiple states intervened. After legal pressure, RadioShack ultimately agreed to reimburse customers for the value of unused gift cards. The customer data sale was modified under court supervision, but the damage to whatever remained of the company's reputation was absolute. RadioShack had built its identity on the idea that it understood its customers, respected their intelligence, and served their interests. In its final weeks, it attempted to monetize their trust. In May 2015, General Wireless, a subsidiary of Standard General, the hedge fund that had been RadioShack's largest shareholder, purchased the company's remaining assets for $26.2 million. Approximately 1,700 stores were kept open under a new arrangement with Sprint, which would operate wireless carrier shops within RadioShack locations. The hope was that the Sprint partnership, restructured and relaunched, might provide the revenue base that had eluded the company for a decade. It did not. Sprint's sales dropped sharply in the fourth quarter of 2016. The mobile commissions that were supposed to anchor the new RadioShack's business model failed to materialize at the levels the restructuring required. In March 2017, General Wireless filed for bankruptcy a second time. RadioShack, at that point, employed approximately 5,900 people. The Fort Worth headquarters, the building that had housed the company Charles Tandy had rebuilt from nothing into a retail empire, faced closure. RadioShack's revenue had fallen every single year since 2006. 11 consecutive quarters of losses before the first bankruptcy, a restructuring that failed within 2 years, a second bankruptcy that left almost nothing standing. The company that had once asked every customer for their name and address because it wanted to know who they were and what they needed, had ended by selling those names to strangers. That was not the RadioShack that anyone remembered. But it was the RadioShack that the decisions of 3 decades had made inevitable. There is a particular kind of institutional death that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a press release or a closing ceremony or a final sale with red banners across the windows. It arrives quietly in the details, in the drawer that used to hold 40 types of capacitors and now holds 12, in the employee who used to know the difference between a PNP and an NPN transistor, and now primarily knows how to process a Sprint upgrade, in the customer who used to come in twice a month and now comes in twice a year and leaves without buying anything because what they came for is no longer there. RadioShack died this way long before the bankruptcy filing made it official. The precise moment is difficult to locate because it was not a moment. It was a direction, a series of decisions made over many years, each one defensible in isolation, each one moving the company incrementally away from the thing that had made it worth defending. But if there is a period when the direction became irreversible, it is the decade between 2004 and 2014 when RadioShack tried, in sequence, nearly everything except the one thing that might have saved it. In 2004, RadioShack launched an in-store wireless kiosk service for big-box retailers, an attempt to extend its wireless expertise beyond its own stores into the retail environments of its competitors. The concept had a certain logic to it. The execution produced revenue without producing identity, and identity was what RadioShack was running out of. In 2005, the company rebranded itself as RadioShack Corporation, dropping the Tandy name that had defined it since 1963 and retiring its private label brands, Realistic, Optimus, that generations of customers had associated with affordable, functional electronics. The rebranding was intended to modernize the company's image. What it actually did was sever the last visible connections to the era when RadioShack had stood for something specific. In 2006, RadioShack launched its ship-to-store e-commerce program, the initiative that allowed customers to order products online and pick them up at a local store. The program was not without merit. It was also 12 years late. Amazon had been operating since 1994. By 2006, Amazon's logistics infrastructure was already sophisticated enough to deliver to most American addresses within 2 days. RadioShack's ship-to-store program asked customers to drive to a strip mall to collect something they could have had delivered to their front door. The customers who tried it once generally did not try it again. Between 2006 and 2014, RadioShack's revenue fell every year without exception. The decline was not a collapse. It was a gradient, steady, consistent, and resistant to every intervention the company attempted. New store designs were introduced and did not reverse it. Marketing campaigns were launched and did not reverse it. Leadership changed 6 times and did not reverse it. The gradient continued because the underlying problem was not a design issue or a marketing issue or a leadership issue. It was an identity issue. An identity cannot be fixed with a new logo or a different CEO from a different industry. By 2014, RadioShack was losing approximately $200 million annually in its mobility business alone, according to figures disclosed in the company's own bankruptcy filing. The wireless strategy that had been adopted as RadioShack's salvation had become its most expensive liability. Mobile carriers had spent the previous 5 years building their own retail stores, clean, well-staffed, purpose-built for exactly the transaction that RadioShack had restructured itself to perform. A customer who wanted to switch carriers or upgrade a phone had no particular reason to do it at RadioShack when a Sprint store or a Verizon store or an A-Tandit store was available, staffed by people whose only job was wireless and who could complete the transaction in a purpose-built environment. RadioShack had traded its identity for a revenue stream, then the revenue stream moved to better facilities. What remained in the stores during these years was a kind of retail archaeology, layers of different strategies visible simultaneously in the same physical space. Near the front, phone display cases, carrier banners, plan comparison charts. In the middle, cables, batteries, accessories, the commodity products that kept the lights on but built no loyalty. Near the back, in the corners, the remnants of what RadioShack had been, a small cabinet of components, a drawer of connectors, a section of wire sold by the foot that nobody young enough to need it knew was there. John Boyes, a writer who worked as a RadioShack employee during this period, described the experience in terms that stayed with the people who read them. He wrote about being required to stock products that no customer in his store had ever asked for, including a line of toy cars based on a British children's television program that had never aired in the United States. He wrote about the gap between what the store was supposed to be and what it had become. A place where the inventory felt chosen by people who had never stood behind a RadioShack counter and watched what customers actually reached for. The customers who had been reaching for the same things for 30 years reached for them less and less. On February 2nd, 2014, RadioShack ran a television advertisement during Super Bowl 28. The ad was, by any measure, clever. It opened inside a RadioShack store, dated, cluttered, recognizably itself, and had a series of celebrities from the 1980s arrive to reclaim it. Hulk Hogan, Alf, Dee Snider of Twisted Sister, a DeLorean. The joke was self-aware. RadioShack knew it had an image problem, and it was willing to laugh at itself publicly, in front of the largest television audience of the year, in order to signal that something new was coming. The commercial was praised, it was discussed. It briefly made RadioShack relevant in a conversation it had not been part of for years. Then the game ended, and nothing changed. RadioShack's same-store sales for the quarter that included the Super Bowl ad declined. The quarter after that declined. The year-over-year revenue comparison for 2014 showed the same gradient that had been visible since 2006, steady, consistent, indifferent to advertising. The problem that the Super Bowl ad had been designed to address was not a perception problem. It was a product problem, a strategy problem, an identity problem that perception alone could not solve. You cannot advertise your way out of not knowing what you are for. But the advertisement revealed something important about where RadioShack's leadership was, emotionally and strategically, in the final year before the bankruptcy. They were still trying. They had not given up. They were spending money on store redesigns, on marketing campaigns, on a wireless partnership that was supposed to generate the revenue that would fund the turnaround. They believed, or needed to believe, that the distance between where RadioShack was and where it needed to be could be closed with the right initiative, the right message, the right quarter. What they could not see, or would not say aloud, was that the distance had been growing for 20 years, and the tools available to close it in a single fiscal year did not exist. The employees inside the stores understood this with a clarity that the quarterly reports did not capture. By 2013 and 2014, working at RadioShack meant operating inside a contradiction that became more visible with each passing month. The stores were being remodeled, new fixtures, new signage, new displays, while the product mix that filled those fixtures made less and less sense to the customers walking through the door. An engineer who had shopped at RadioShack since the 1970s might walk in looking for a specific type of connector and find the component section reduced to a single small display near the rear wall. A parent looking for an educational electronics kit, the kind of product that RadioShack had sold for decades, the kind that had introduced a generation of Americans to the principles of circuits and current, might find that the kit section had been replaced by a wall of Beats headphones. The headphones also sold at Best Buy, at Target, at Amazon, at the Apple Store, and at every carrier retail location in the country, all of which had more floor space, more inventory depth, and lower prices than RadioShack could offer. Competing on commodity electronics in a market that had commoditized everything was not a strategy. It was a way of losing slowly enough that each individual quarter looked survivable. Outside the stores, the hobbyist community that had been RadioShack's original constituency was not disappearing. It was relocating. Fry's Electronics, where it existed, had picked up the slack on components. Online retailers, DigiKey Mouser, Spark Fun, were shipping individual resistors and microcontrollers directly to the hobbyists who needed them, at prices and selection depths that no physical store could match. The maker movement of the 2010s, the resurgence of DIY electronics culture that produced Arduino boards and Raspberry Pi computers and thousands of community hackerspaces across the country, was built almost entirely without RadioShack. The store that had once been the entry point for every American who wanted to learn how electronics worked had been absent from that conversation for long enough that an entire generation of makers had grown up not thinking of it at all. That was perhaps the most damning measure of what had been lost. Not the revenue numbers, though they were damning enough. Not the store count, though watching 7,000 locations decline toward zero was its own kind of arithmetic grief. But the fact that when a new generation of Americans caught the same fever that RadioShack had been built to serve, the desire to understand how things worked and to build something from nothing, they found their community, their components, and their education somewhere else entirely. RadioShack had been the store that taught America how to build things. By 2014, America had found other teachers, and in Fort Worth, in the headquarters that Charles Tandy had built into the center of an electronics empire, 11 consecutive quarters of financial losses were about to become something worse than a number on a balance sheet. They were about to become a date on a calendar. The last normal day at most RadioShack stores was a Saturday. Sunday, February 1st, 2015, the first day of RadioShack's new fiscal year, was not a normal day. It was the day the company stopped pretending. Employees who arrived for their morning shifts that Sunday found managers who would not meet their eyes. Some had received calls the night before, brief and businesslike, informing them that their location was closing and they should not report in the morning. Others found out in the parking lot. A few learned when the key no longer worked in the lock. There was no script for what was happening because RadioShack had not written one, had not prepared a statement for employees, had not arranged for severance counselors, had not done the basic organizational work of treating the people who had kept its stores running as something other than a line item being zeroed out. The stores that closed that Sunday closed without ceremony. No final sale, no thank you sign in the window, no acknowledgement that this location, this specific building, in this specific neighborhood, where specific people had shopped for specific things for decades, was ending. The RadioShack sign came down eventually, but not that day. That day the lights simply did not come on, and the parking lot that had been full on Saturday was empty on Sunday, and the people who drove past on their way to church or to the grocery store noticed, or they didn't. The stores that remained open that Sunday did so not because they had a future, but because a loan covenant said they had to. RadioShack's borrowing arrangement with Solace Capital restricted the company to closing no more than 200 stores per year. This restriction, designed to protect the lender's collateral, had the practical effect of forcing RadioShack to keep operating locations that everyone involved knew were not viable. The stores ran with skeleton crews, sometimes 2 or 3 employees for a full shift, and shelves that had been quietly stripped of inventory in the preceding weeks, as merchandise was transferred to locations that might survive the restructuring. Customers who walked in during those final weeks found a store that looked like RadioShack, but felt like something else, the physical space of a brand that had already vacated itself. On February 3rd, RadioShack defaulted on its loan from Solace Capital, On February 5th, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court in Delaware. The filing was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching. What surprised people, what produced a specific sharp quality of anger among RadioShack's customers, was what the company included in its list of assets. The personal information of 67 million customers, names, addresses, purchase histories, the accumulated record of every transaction that RadioShack had logged against a customer name over the years. Every time a cashier had asked for a zip code, every time a customer had signed up for a promotion, every time the loyalty program had recorded what someone bought and when and where. RadioShack's privacy policy had stated explicitly and publicly that this information would never be sold for any reason at any time. The policy had been cited internally as a foundation of customer trust. It had been the stated justification for collecting the data in the first place. In the bankruptcy filing, that data was listed as a corporate asset with a market value. The response was immediate. Attorneys general from multiple states filed objections. Consumer advocacy groups issued statements. Former customers who had spent decades giving RadioShack their personal information because they trusted the company's explicit promise now understood that the promise had been, in the end, contingent on the company's solvency. RadioShack ultimately agreed, under legal pressure, to reimburse customers for unused gift cards and to modify the terms of the data sale under court supervision. But the modification came after the damage, not to the asset, but to the memory of what RadioShack had claimed to be, was already complete. The bankruptcy filing announced the immediate closure of 1,784 stores. The pace was not chosen for operational reasons. It was chosen because RadioShack needed to complete the closures before the end of February to avoid approximately $7 million in March rent obligations. The stores that had served specific communities for decades were being closed on a timetable set by a lease calendar, not by any consideration of what those communities would lose. In North Texas alone, in the Fort Worth area, where RadioShack had been headquartered for more than 5 decades, approximately 1,000 employees at the company's headquarters and regional distribution center were told that their positions were in jeopardy. The documents filed with the Texas Workforce Commission use the language that such documents always use: clinical, passive, bureaucratic. The human content of those documents was different. These were people who had built careers inside a company that had, at its best, represented something genuinely worth building a career inside. They were being processed out of that career by a bankruptcy court in Delaware. In the weeks following the February 5th filing, the closures moved through America's strip malls and shopping centers, like a wave that no one had organized and no one was watching. The process was not cinematic. There was no single moment, no symbolic door closing, no gathering of employees in a parking lot to mark what was ending. There were instead thousands of individual endings, each one small, each one local, each one unremarked upon by anyone outside the immediate neighborhood. A RadioShack in suburban Ohio locked its doors on a Tuesday afternoon. A location in an Arizona strip mall ran a liquidation sale for 11 days and then went dark. A store in a Minnesota shopping center, the same one that had sold TRS-80 computers in 1977 to people who drove across the county to get there, put a hand-lettered sign in the window that said, "Everything must go," and meant it literally. The red and white signage came down. The display cases were sold. The remaining inventory, cables, batteries, connectors, the last few components in the last few drawers, was liquidated at prices that suggested the company understood it would not need to maintain anyone's goodwill going forward. In May 2015, General Wireless purchased RadioShack's surviving assets for $26.2 million. A figure that, measured against the $3 billion in annual revenue the company had generated at its peak, requires no additional commentary. Approximately 1,700 stores were retained under the new ownership, restructured around the Sprint partnership that was supposed to provide the revenue base for a second life. The second life lasted less than 2 years. Sprint's sales performance in the RadioShack locations declined through 2016. Mobile commissions, the revenue stream that the entire restructuring had been built around, failed to reach the levels that the business model required. In March 2017, General Wireless filed for bankruptcy a second time. The company that had survived its first death by becoming a Sprint kiosk could not survive its second death by becoming anything at all. Approximately 200 stores closed immediately. Hundreds more were converted to Sprint-only locations. The RadioShack name, which had meant something specific and irreplaceable for the better part of a century, was now a sign above a wireless carrier outlet that happened to be located where a RadioShack used to be. The Fort Worth headquarters closed. The building that had housed the company Charles Tandy had rescued from bankruptcy in 1963. The building where the TRS-80 had been conceived and approved and almost rejected, and then launched into a market that wanted 50,000 of them before the company had manufactured 3,500. Emptied out over the spring and summer of 2017. The people who had worked there collected their things and left, as people do when a building stops being a workplace and becomes a vacancy. By the end of 2017, RadioShack as a functioning American retail chain was effectively finished. What remained was a brand, a name, a logo, a set of intellectual property rights that passed through several more hands in the years that followed. Retail e-commerce ventures acquired the assets in 2020 and operated RadioShack as an online-only venture, selling consumer electronics through a website that carried the name and the color scheme, but none of the institutional knowledge that the name had once represented. In May 2023, a company called Unicomer Group, based in El Salvador and operating across Latin America and the Caribbean, acquired the worldwide RadioShack business, including the intellectual property covering approximately 70 countries, for $5 million. $5 million for a name that had once been worth $3 billion a year in revenue. The arithmetic of that decline is not complicated. What is worth considering is what the arithmetic measures. It does not measure a brand that failed to compete. It measures a brand that competed successfully for nearly a century, that built genuine loyalty among the most technically engaged customers in America, that put the first mass-market personal computer into American homes, that employed the people who could explain what was inside the box after you bought it, and then, through a sequence of decisions spread across 3 decades, dismantled every advantage it had built until the name itself was the only thing left to sell. The last RadioShack store that most Americans remember is not the one that closed in 2017. It is the one that was already gone. The one with the full component drawers and the knowledgeable staff and the Saturday afternoon feeling of being in a place where someone would take your questions seriously, whatever your question was. That store had been closing, quietly and without announcement, since sometime in the 1990s. The bankruptcy filing in 2015 was the paperwork for a death that had already occurred. The staccato of it, at the end, was almost gentle. The leases expired. The signs came down. The parking lots filled with other businesses. The drawers of components went to estate sales and online auctions. The name went to a hedge fund, then to an e-commerce venture, then to a company in El Salvador. The knowledge went nowhere. It simply stopped being passed on. The buildings did not wait long to become something else. In Fort Worth, the corporate headquarters that Charles Tandy had built into the operational center of a retail empire was repurposed. The Tandy Center, once a landmark of downtown Fort Worth, a complex that had included office towers, an ice skating rink, and an underground shopping mall, had already undergone redevelopment in the years before the final bankruptcy. The city that RadioShack had called home for more than 5 decades moved on with the particular efficiency that American cities apply to the spaces left behind by departed institutions. Across the country, the strip mall locations that RadioShack had occupied for decades were absorbed back into the retail landscape with minimal disruption. Nail salons moved in, vape shops, dollar stores, insurance offices, tax preparation services. The small format spaces that RadioShack had pioneered, the neighborhood-scale retail footprint that Charles Tandy had positioned as the company's primary competitive advantage, turned out to be useful for all manner of businesses that had nothing to do with electronics and no interest in the customers RadioShack had once served. The customers themselves scattered. The hobbyists and engineers who had relied on RadioShack for components found their way to online suppliers, DigiKey, Mouser Electronics, Spark Fun, that offered selection depths no physical store had ever matched, at prices that reflected the global economics of electronic components rather than the margins of a strip mall retailer. The transition was not painless. For a specific category of customer, older, less comfortable with online ordering, accustomed to the experience of holding a component before buying it and asking a knowledgeable person whether it was the right one. The loss of RadioShack was a loss that online retail did not fully replace. A 2010 article in Wired magazine, written 5 years before the bankruptcy, had already identified this community by name, the Lost Tribes of RadioShack. The piece documented the tinkerers and builders who had organized their hobby lives around RadioShack's component selection and were now, as that selection shrank, looking for a new spiritual home. They found partial replacements, Fry's Electronics while it lasted, community maker spaces, online forums, the Arduino and Raspberry Pi ecosystems that had built a new infrastructure for DIY electronics largely independent of any physical retail chain. But the specific combination that RadioShack had offered, components, knowledge, and proximity all in a single neighborhood location, was not replicated by any of its successors. What was lost was not merely a store, it was a particular kind of access. RadioShack had operated at the intersection of affordability, availability, and expertise in a way that lowered the entry barrier for electronics experimentation to nearly zero. A 12-year-old with $5 and a question could walk into a RadioShack and walk out with the materials and the understanding needed to begin a project. That transaction, $5, one question, one knowledgeable employee, one afternoon of possibility, was not available on a website. It was not available at Best Buy. It was not available anywhere that RadioShack was not. The TRS-80 computers that RadioShack had manufactured between 1977 and 1993 are now collector's items. Working Model 1 units in good condition sell at auction for prices that would have seemed absurd to the customers who bought them new for $599. The machines are maintained by a community of enthusiasts, the TRS-80 revived site, the Classic Computer Museum, individual collectors who keep the hardware running because the hardware represents something they are not willing to let go of. A book published in 2007 titled Priming the Pump: How TRS-80 Enthusiasts Helped Spark the PC Revolution documents the degree to which the TRS-80's early user community shaped the culture of personal computing in ways that the industry's standard narrative, centered on Apple and IBM, has consistently underrepresented. The machine that RadioShack almost decided not to build, and then deliberately decided to deprioritize, turned out to have mattered more than the company ever gave it credit for. Charles Tandy died in 1978, before the TRS-80 had fully established itself, before the decisions that would eventually unwind everything he had built had been made. He did not see the computer boom that his company helped start. He did not see the cell phone pivot that traded the company's identity for a revenue stream. He did not see the bankruptcy filings, the hedge fund acquisition, the $5 million sale of a name that had once anchored one of the most recognized retail brands in America. What he saw, in the 15 years between buying a near-bankrupt electronics chain for $300,000 and dying of a heart attack at 60, was the part of the RadioShack story that was worth seeing. A company built around the belief that ordinary Americans deserved access to the tools and knowledge needed to understand how the world around them worked. That belief was not wrong. It was simply abandoned by the people who inherited it. There is a version of the RadioShack story that ends with a balance sheet, 94 years of operation, 2 bankruptcy filings, a brand sold for $5 million to a company based in El Salvador, thousands of empty storefronts in thousands of American strip malls, a privacy promise broken in a Delaware courtroom. That version of the story is accurate. It is also incomplete. The complete version begins not with the bankruptcy, but with the 12-year-old. Every generation that grew up between the 1950s and the 1990s produced a version of the same child, curious about electricity, drawn to the idea that the invisible forces running through a wire could be understood and directed and made to do something useful. That child needed a starting point, a place where the entry barrier was low enough to be crossed on an allowance, where the person behind the counter would answer a question without making the asker feel foolish, where the gap between curiosity and capability could be bridged for the cost of a resistor and an afternoon. For 4 decades, that place was RadioShack. The engineers and programmers and makers who came of age during RadioShack's peak years carry the evidence of that in their careers. Many of them can identify, with the specificity that comes from genuine memory, The exact Radio Shack where something began for them, the store where they bought their first soldering iron, their first crystal radio kit, their first TRS-80, their first length of wire for a project they were not entirely sure would work. The store is gone. The memory of what the store made possible is not. The TRS-80 community remains active more than 4 decades after the Model 1's introduction. Collectors maintain working machines, share software, and document the hardware's history with an attention to detail that the company that built the machine never applied to its own legacy. The book Priming the Pump, published in 2007, argued, with evidence that the TRS-80's early user community seeded the personal computer industry with programmers, designers, and entrepreneurs whose contributions have been systematically under-attributed because the machine they learned on was called the Trash 80, and its manufacturer was a leather company from Fort Worth. History, as the saying goes, is written by the survivors. The surprise footnote in the Radio Shack story is not the bankruptcy. It is the people the company produced without knowing it was producing them. Steve Leininger, who designed the TRS-80 at 24 years old and left Radio Shack at 29, when the company stopped listening to what he was building toward, went on to a career in technology that outlasted the company that had employed him. Don French, whose proposal for a chain of Tandy computer centers was rejected because the company could not see past its own retail model, was vindicated by history in the most complete way available. The thing he proposed became, under different names and different ownership, the dominant model of technology retail for the following 3 decades. Radio Shack said no to the future twice. Once, when an executive told Don French not to waste his time with computers. Once, when a management directive capped computer sales at 10% of the business mix because the margins were thin. Both times, the future arrived anyway. Both times, Radio Shack was not in it. What remains of Radio Shack in 2024 is a website operated by a company that owns the intellectual property and the color scheme and the logo. The site sells consumer electronics. It does not sell components in meaningful depth. It does not employ people who can explain the difference between a capacitor and a resistor. It does not have a counter where a child with a question can receive an answer. It is a brand without the thing that made the brand worth having. A name floating free of the culture and the knowledge and the specific human transaction that the name once represented. The Radio Shack that Americans remember does not exist on that website. It exists in the basements and garages of the people it made. It exists in the working TRS-80 that someone powered up last week to show their grandchild what a computer looked like before computers were everywhere. It exists in the soldering iron that a retired engineer still keeps on his workbench, bought at a Radio Shack in 1974, still functional, the brand long gone and the tool still doing exactly what it was designed to do. It exists in the specific memory of a Saturday afternoon, the smell of solder, the weight of a component in a small paper bag, the feeling of walking out of a store with something that had not existed in your possession an hour earlier. Radio Shack did not teach America what to build. It taught America that building was possible. That lesson outlasted the company. It outlasted the stores. It outlasted the bankruptcy filings and the hedge fund acquisitions and the $5 million sale of a century-old name. Somewhere tonight, in a basement in Ohio or a garage in New Mexico, someone is bent over a workbench with a soldering iron in one hand and a schematic in the other, working through a problem that has no instructions and no guarantee and no deadline except the one they set for themselves. The components on that bench came from somewhere. The knowledge of how to use them came from somewhere. For a long time, both of those things came from a small store with a red and white sign in a strip mall at the edge of a neighborhood that stayed open on Saturdays. See you in the next one.